All right, good morning and welcome to our second Water Quality Wednesday. This is the first webinar of the year, but we actually had one back in December on phosphorus and nutrient management that is available on the OSU Agronomic YouTube. If you're interested in going back and watching that, we'll post the link in the chat in a few minutes. Today, we're going to be listening to a webinar on watershed planning. So step into town hall, then step into your field from watershed planning to field level implementation. And we're going to hear from two of our water quality associates on their experience with watershed planning and outreach in the community and related to some of our watershed plans that we are working on as a team. My name is Bridget Moneymaker, and we also have Jordan Beck. We are two other water quality extension associates who cover Allen, Always, and Mercer, and then Jordan covers Fulton, Lucas, and Williams. There are emails if you're interested in contacting us for any reason, and we are also on our website, which we'll also post in the chat soon if you're interested in learning more about what we are up to in the counties that we cover. So like I mentioned, this is the first one of the year, and then we also have two other ones coming up later, three other ones coming up later. February 2nd, we'll be looking into conservation drainage, doing a deep dive on that best management practice with some videos and speakers with experts. On February 16th, we'll be looking into nitrogen efficiency and loss prevention. And then March 23rd, we'll do emerging tech and water quality, and we'll be hearing from remote sensing specialists and learning more about some of our remote sensing and field planning that we're doing with some of these projects that we've been working on the last 2 years. Feel free to register for these at the link in the chat, and you can also scan this QR code and you'll be taken directly to the page. You can register for one of them or all of them. If you sign up, you'll get email reminders, and you'll also get the post-webinar email with all the information if you want to watch it on YouTube later. All right, I'm gonna let Matt take it away.
All right, thanks, Bridget. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Just give me 1 second here. All right, so just to start off, I want to give you guys just a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering today. So I'm going to start off by just going over generally what watershed planning is and why it is needed. Then I will go over how that watershed planning process works, and I will discuss 6 specific steps that go into that watershed planning process. Then I'm going to end the talk today by going over the agricultural conservation planning framework. I'll talk about what that is exactly and how our water quality team is using that in the watershed planning process. So what is watershed planning? It is an approach to managing water resources within a specific drainage area. So this is an important concept because it allows us to prioritize areas that have the greatest need, and it allows us to focus our resources where they're really going to have the biggest impact or the biggest return on investment. Watershed planning is also a series of steps that are cooperative in that they're designed to work together and build on one another. And the steps are also iterative in the sense that once the watershed plan is implemented, it needs to be continually monitored, adjusted, and improved upon to meet the water quality goals set for that drainage area. The watershed planning process also includes stakeholder involvement and management actions based on science. So stakeholder involvement is really important because we need to identify feasible management actions that can be taken to hit those nutrient load reduction goals. This means identifying specific management strategies that actually have a chance at being adopted in those watersheds. So why do we need watershed planning? Well, the big thing I think everybody is able to point to pretty quick is Lake Erie. So the algae blooms on Lake Erie draw the public's eye to water quality issues in our state on a yearly basis. All right, but water resources are really important everywhere. It's not just the Western Lake Erie Basin. And people have been grappling with the management of water resources for a long time. It wasn't until 1972 that Congress passed the Clean Water Act, which is our nation's federal approach to managing water resources across the United States. Now, much of the responsibility for actually implementing this federal law is left up to the states. The framework for this program was intended to provide kind of a national approach and a base level of protection across the entire country, but still have enough flexibility to be able to address local resource concerns and the concerns of local communities. For our purposes, when we're talking about watershed planning, much of what we're interested in actually comes from Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, which deals with non-point source pollution. The 319 program is completely non-regulatory, but it attempts to set up a framework for states to deal with non-point source pollution by basically just asking states to start by assessing the problem, create some kind of program to control that problem, and then the program actually provides funding to states to start to carry out some of that work. Here you can see what that funding has looked like historically for the program. Over the past 10 years, the 319 program has supplied between $150 and $200 million to states each year to address non-point source pollution. In order for the EPA to actually fund a project using 319 funds, they require watershed plans to address 9 key elements that are critical for improving water quality. In Ohio, the plan we came up with for implementing those 9 elements into a watershed plan is called a non-point source implementation strategy, or a NPSIS plan. So sometimes you might hear somebody say NPSIS plan, other times you might hear somebody say 9-element plan. They're both basically just referring to a watershed plan that's focused on non-point source pollution. So there's a lot of other pieces to the Clean Water Act that I'm not going to go over today, but I wanted to give at least a high-level overview of how the Clean Water Act guides the development of our NPSIS watershed plans. There have also been a bunch of other efforts and agreements over the years aimed at addressing water quality in the Great Lakes. So also in 1972, the United States and Canada committed to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was a binational agreement to restore and protect the waters of the Great Lakes. There was also the Western Basin of Lake Erie Collaborative Agreement in 2015. This was another binational agreement between the governors in the Western Lake Erie Basin states, as well as the Premier of the province of Ontario. And through this agreement, the parties set a goal to work towards a 40% total load reduction in the amount of total and dissolved reactive phosphorus entering Lake Erie's Western Basin by 2025. So these were some very aspirational goals. And really, in order for us to have any chance at achieving these goals, we need to be utilizing some type of science-based framework to guide our efforts. And that's why watershed planning is needed, because it gives us that structured framework to kind of get started on this. Now I'd like to spend some time just going over how the watershed planning process works. So watershed planning can get complicated when you start digging into all of the different parts and the steps that go into it. But I was on a meeting a few months back and I heard a gentleman from Iowa who was doing this kind of work describe the process in really a kind of simple way that stuck with me. And I found it useful when trying to explain just really generally how the process works. He said, in order to develop this watershed management plan, you basically just need to answer 3 questions. So first question is what? All right, so what steps can we take to reduce nutrient loads in the basin? Are there different management strategies that we can identify? Are there opportunities to cite conservational practices in the watershed? And then how do we answer that question? And basically we answer it using farmer input. So this is a simplification. We really rely on input from all the stakeholders, but in all honesty, farmers are a lot of the times the ones making the management decisions on the acres that need addressed in these watersheds. The second question we need to ask is how much? So how much of a specific conservation practice is needed in a watershed to meet local water quality goals? And that question is answered using nutrient reduction science. So different conservation practices have different degrees of effectiveness when it comes to reducing nutrient loads. By studying the efficacy of different practices in different scenarios, we can estimate how a practice might perform if we include it in our watershed plan. So we can come up with a plan, for example, that says something like, if we want to reduce total phosphorus by 40%, we need to plant cover crops on X% of the farmed acres in the watershed. All right, so that's another simplification, but hopefully you kind of get the idea how that works. Realistically, when we come up with a comprehensive watershed plan, we're going to see a bunch of different types of practices being promoted. And then the last question we need to answer to come up with this watershed plan is where. So now that we know what practices address the driving forces that are important to our stakeholders, and we have an idea about the quantity of those practices that's needed in our watershed, we need to answer that final question: where are the opportunities for conservation within the watershed? Now, a lot of that is, going to be up to the farmers or the landowners as to what happens on their property. But a lot of it is actually controlled by local terrain and hydrography as well. So to answer the question where, we're using a tool called the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, or ACPF for short. And this is a GIS tool. It was developed by the USDA ARS, and it uses publicly available data layers to facilitate terrain analysis on small watersheds, and then identify opportunities for citing a variety of different structural best management practices. So we can take maps produced from this software and offer farmers in the watershed a kind of menu of conservation options to choose from to help meet the goals that are set for that drainage area. I'll talk a little bit more about ACPF here in a little bit, but now we have all kind of the three questions answered here. We have all of the basic components we need to create our management plan. All right. So like I said, that was a relatively simple explanation of how it works. I like it though, because it makes it easy for people to understand the process, and also because it shows how that ACPF tool kind of fits into the picture, which isn't always done because it's kind of a new tool that we're using here in Ohio. So now that I've gone over kind of the simple explanation, I just want to expand on it a little bit. And I'm going to discuss 6 specific steps that go into that watershed planning process. And as you will see as I go through these, each one of these steps contain several steps within it to kind of guide that process along. But the first 3 steps here, which are build partnerships, characterize the watershed, and creating the goals and solutions, those are all focused on kind of preparing everything that's needed to go into the development of that plan. Everything kind of gets pulled together in step 4 when we design the implementation plan. And then the last 2 steps, which are implement the plan and monitor and adjust the plan, those are really the most important steps to the ultimate success of the project. So the first step, which is building partnerships, should ideally be taking place well in advance of any formal meetings or plan development. Identifying the key stakeholders and driving forces in a particular watershed are crucial to developing a plan that's focused on local resource concerns as well as the concerns of the community. And really, the success of the plan will primarily depend on the commitment and the involvement of the community members. So 2 questions to consider are: who are the stakeholders that we want to identify, and what is their role in the process? So stakeholders can be people in an area that make and implement decisions. They could be people who are affected by those decisions, or they could be people who, for whatever reason, just have the ability to assist or impede in the implementations of those decisions that are made. So those are a few broad categories, but these could just be like community members that have technical experience or the ability to help the implementation process. They might be local community leaders, political leadership, policy makers. You might have media folks from the newspaper or the radio. Obviously, landowners and farmers are an important group to have included. And then what do these people, what's the role that these people play in the watershed planning process? Well, stakeholders are very important because they make sure that local concerns are factored into the decisions that are being made. They share the responsibility in actually making those decisions, and they facilitate in the network and the partnership building process that draws support for the project. Stakeholders help create the framework, and they help in the planning and the management of the activities. And they also help implement the plan once it is created. So it's really important to have good partnerships identified early on. And it's also important to think about how these efforts could be integrated with other efforts that may be going on in the area as kind of a way to enhance or enhance different impacts or efficiency of different programs. Then the next step in the process is to characterize the watershed. So this is where we start to gather as much existing data about the watershed together as we can. We create kind of a data inventory and we identify gaps that may exist in that inventory. And then that really starts to define the scope of what's going to go into our planning effort. So some of the different types of data that we might focus on collecting at this stage could be related to physical or natural features like watershed boundaries, topography, soil types, hydrology, maybe the kind of wildlife that might exist in an area. We're also interested in understanding information related to land use, like existing management practices, or maybe population characteristics like demographics in a certain area. We need to identify existing information on water quality standards, priority designations. If a TMDL has been created for a watershed, that must be considered. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details here about water quality standards or TMDLs. These are basically just tools that we use to determine if a watershed is meeting the criteria set for its designated use. Paige will talk a little bit more about some of these things in her presentation following this, but for now, we just want to locate these data where they exist and then use them to characterize our watershed. Once we have the data that we need to characterize our watershed, there may be some data analysis that's required, and this might include things like monitoring pollutant loads over time or estimating loads from the watershed or specific subcatchments within that watershed. So any watershed modeling that's needed for the plan is also included at this point. And there are several different types of models that may be used for different applications. And these could include things like modeling surface hydrology, soil erosion, or pollutant loads, just to name a few types. Then in step 3, we create our goals and identify possible solutions for meeting those goals. So it's really important in this step that we are creating goals that are achievable, both technically and financially, but also goals that are measurable so we can track our progress and adjust the plan if it's necessary. So we need to set targets that we want to hit, and we need to identify indicators to show if the management actions that we're putting in place are actually getting us on track to hit those targets. All right, so then lastly, we need to decide which management strategies we're going to focus on in order to achieve the goals that we've identified in our plans. Then once we have all of our information compiled, we move on to step 4, which is where we finally pull everything together that we've been working on for our watershed plan. We develop the schedule where the management strategies that we've identified are going to be implemented. There needs to be interim milestones developed that are used to track the implementation process. So we might set up some type of criteria that we're using to measure the progress. And this might be things like tracking program participation numbers, tracking the total number of practices adopted, how many acres were enrolled in a certain practice, things that are measurable that show us if our efforts are effective or if we need to rethink how we're approaching the problem. Then we need to set up a monitoring component and an educational component to the watershed plan, as well as an evaluation process to help us improve the plan over time. And then another big part of this design phase of watershed planning is the next bullet point here, which is identify technical and financial assistance needed. So dealing with the requirement of developing a viable plan with funding for projects that require some degree of technical expertise to implement can be challenging. And then some stakeholders in the community are likely better suited to offering technical advice on project implementation, while there may be other folks that are better suited for identifying funding sources for specific projects. So this is another place where it's really important to have that community involvement, because no one person is probably an expert in all of the required areas to complete something like this. But we can really accomplish more by working collaboratively in the community. Then lastly, we need to make sure that there's someone out there who's basically just assigned the responsibility of reviewing and revising that plan into the future to make sure that the watershed remains on a course intended by the watershed plan. Then in step 5, we implement the plan. And that seems straightforward. And if we did a good job in the planning process, implementation should go smoothly. This is where we need to start conducting monitoring both of the watershed plan and the implementation process to make sure that our progress is being made as it was designed. And we need to conduct our informational and educational activities here so we can inform our community and our stakeholders about the progress that's being made. Then finally, the last step is to monitor the progress and adjust the plan as needed. So once the watershed plan is implemented, the work isn't finished. Changes may need to be made to the plan if certain pieces of it are not performing as expected. So continual review and adjustment needs to be made in order to achieve or maintain the water quality goals set for a watershed. So this is the iterative part of the plan that makes a watershed plan a living document because it's not complete after one attempt. It continues to live on and adjust and improve as time goes on. So those are the 6 steps to watershed planning. As you can see, there are a lot of pieces to it. I started off with kind of a general description of the planning process that focused on those 3 questions: what, how much, and where. Then I expanded it out to the description with the 6 steps. Along the way, I mentioned 9 key elements critical to the watershed planning. And here you can see what those specific 9 elements are. Don't be confused by the letters here instead of the numbers. The intent was really just to not confuse the 9 elements with the 6 steps that were discussed. So here you can actually see where each of those 9 key elements fit into the 6-step planning process, which when you really break it down is more like a 29-step process. So that is the watershed planning process. Now I would like to spend the rest of my time here by going back and talking some more about the Acpf tool that I mentioned earlier. So we're mainly interested in using the tool here in step 3 to help us identify possible management measures that can be taken in a watershed to help achieve its water quality goals. It can also be useful in step 2 when we're characterizing the watershed, but the real value of the tool lies in its ability to help inform the watershed planning process. So the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, it's a GIS tool used to help locate potential opportunities to site conservation practices on the landscape. The tool was developed by the USDA ARS, and it utilizes high-resolution publicly available geospatial data layers, such as a 10-meter soil raster, a land use classification layer, and a high-resolution digital elevation model, or DEM. The high-resolution DEM is one of the most fundamental pieces used in the Acpf because the tool was designed to help facilitate terrain analysis and then use those outputs from the terrain analysis to help inform conservation practice siting efforts. So Acpf analyses are run on Huck 12 sized watersheds. So these are small watersheds, and we're really using the highest resolution data layers that we have available. So this really starts to facilitate our ability to start identifying opportunities for conservation at the field scale. To learn more about the software, you can visit the website shown here, acpf4watersheds.org. The Acpf toolbox has a number of tools within it for citing a variety of different conservation practices. So this gives stakeholders a kind of menu of conservation options to choose from. That way they can hopefully find something that works well for their specific situation, focusing on local needs. Now, I won't go through all of the different outputs from the tool today, but I have included a few slides to highlight some of the practices that we're interested in and to show you kind of how the tool works. So there's a grass waterway tool. Grass waterways are a very popular conservation practice across the region. The tool identifies locations within the watershed that are highly susceptible to erosion and could benefit from the practice. I should also mention here that most of the tools in the ACPF toolbox have different parameters that can be adjusted. So the outputs of the tool are really best suited for the landscape or the specific project that's being worked on. A lot of crop fields in Northwest Ohio have subsurface tile drainage installed. And one popular conservation strategy that can be considered in these systems is drainage water management. Basically, instead of a tile line running directly into a ditch, a control structure is installed that allows users to control the level of the water table in the field by adding or removing gates inside the structure. Raising the water table through the winter months and the growing season can reduce the total quantity of water discharged into the watershed, which reduces total nutrient loads. This tool identifies individual fields within a watershed that meet the user set criteria for implementing an effective management strategy using drainage control structures. Nutrient removal wetlands are another conservation practice that have been getting a lot of attention recently. ACPF can help identify locations in a watershed that may be naturally conducive to the installation of a wetland. Again, focusing on the use of different terrain properties like soil attributes and land use. Saturated buffers are another conservation practice that utilize drainage control structures, but in this case, water is diverted laterally along a vegetated buffer zone where it is allowed to saturate that zone and then slowly infiltrate into the stream. So for this practice to be effective, the slope of the land needs to be just right. So the buffer zone saturates, but not the crop fields. Soil type is also considered when siting saturated buffers because for successful denitrification, for example, requires a certain level of carbon in the soil profile. So this tool identifies subcatchments that may have riparian corridors suitable for this practice. ACPF analyses produce a number of different layers, such as surface flow, stream networks, subcatchments, and many other common outputs that you might expect in a GIS watershed tool. But ACPF goes a step further, and it uses some of those outputs and terrain properties to inform conservation planning efforts. For example, the riparian function assessment tool considers the size of a subcatchment and relates that to the total amount of runoff delivery to a specific corridor segment. It also considers the width of the riparian zone and the height of land above the channel to estimate how much overland versus subsurface flow to expect in each riparian management zone. It then uses those measures to create a type of classification matrix that can be used to inform how a vegetated riparian buffer zone should be best designed. So the tool can offer watershed managers insight into how large a riparian buffer should be for a given stream segment and what types of vegetation could be considered. The runoff risk assessment tool uses land use classification and terrain properties to classify agricultural fields within a watershed in terms of their runoff risk. This offers watershed planners and managers a way of prioritizing the most effective acres to target for possible conservation to meet local load reduction goals. There are several other outputs from ACPF that I don't really have time to go over, but those are some popular ones that I like for our landscape in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Now, I would like to wrap it up just by talking a little bit about how we can use ACPF for watershed planning. So just running the GIS tool is only part of the process. The tools were really designed to facilitate conservation planning based on the conservation pyramid shown here. The idea is that conservation begins in the field by implementing sustainable practices that build soil health, because these are really the most effective strategies to address nutrient loading in the watershed. ACPF helps identify additional opportunities for conservation further down the watershed. The idea being that stacking additional conservation practices along a flow path can further reduce nutrient loads further downstream. The strategy of watershed management has some real benefits, such as offering a concise, science-driven method for planning to meet nutrient reduction goals within a basin. It also offers us a new way to approach farmers and landowners who may otherwise be uninterested in getting involved in some of these government programs. By running an Acpf analysis for a watershed, we're creating kind of a menu of conservation options for people to choose from. And the tool really allows us to focus our efforts and our resources in locations that could have the biggest return on investment. So instead of relying on kind of random acts of conservation to meet our water quality goals in the basin, we can start to develop a science-based approach that has a better chance for success. So I'm going to wrap it up here and hand it off to Paige for the next segment. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I have to leave my camera off. I'm actually in Shelby County today, and I'm a little bit worried about the internet connection. So just bear with me here. I also am battling a little bit of a cold. So just to introduce myself, I am new to OSU. I work in Hancock, Hardin, and Putnam County, and I specialize in hydrological systems. I used to do large-scale animal production and also nutrient management. I just wanted to begin by discussing a little bit deeper the critical steps in watershed planning. In the past, local counties have hired engineering firms or completed these themselves. Recently, Ohio EPA funded us, the Ohio State University Extension Water Quality Associates, to complete some of these projects in areas deemed in need of NPSIS plans. Our team also worked on other watershed projects that I'll discuss later in this presentation. At times, funding can be an initial step as a catalyst in the process, but typically more funding will be needed as the project develops critical areas and goals. Partnerships can make or break these plans, as you'll hear later in this presentation. I call this the foundation. From there, you are building, from there, the plans are built using research. I'll briefly discuss funding. Ohio EPA offers funding opportunities through 319 grants provided by the Clean Water Act. Funding for 2022 closed in the fall of 2021, but there's always opportunities to begin thinking ahead to next year. This is how our team was able to obtain funding for some of our research. As you can see, millions of dollars are dispersed each year through 319 grants. There is also a great opportunity provided through H2O Ohio and NRCS Equip. I'm not going to go into details on funding because it can vary depending on the watershed and the type of plan, but for particulars on funding, it would benefit you to reach out to your OSU Extension team or NRCS for direction. Building relationships through partnerships is a critical part of this process. I put some logos on the slide of potential partners, but the opportunities are endless here. A big part of this is fulfilled through stakeholder outreach. Partnerships are certainly not limited to these. Thinking outside of the box can bridge relationships that will catapult these plans into success. The relationships formed will determine how relevant the final product is to that area. The relationships include, but are not limited to, local soil and water representatives, local landowners, and farmers. Together, each of these parties have individual interests that will provide key insight in the final product. Outreach is critical to a successful plan. It creates the opportunity for community buy-in in the development of projects. From the outreach, there will be an advisory group created. The advisory group is a compilation of stakeholders listed above, typically those that have expressed a higher interest and involvement in the project. Some helpful ways to document the stakeholders' opinions and knowledge is through surveys, group meetings, interviews, and articles. It's also very important to keep the stakeholders informed as they participate in the project. We understand that their investment is valuable and must be upheld. I like the little graphic that EPA created to help build public support. This certainly isn't something that someone or a group can do overnight, but instead develop and grow over time. Research is a group effort. The research portion of this plan of watershed planning is when you really get to know the watershed. Typically, these plans hold research that is both old and new. By working in groups, each stakeholder typically brings a diverse point of view on things. Luckily for us, EPA has provided the public with numerous resources for watershed planning with both point and non-point source pollution issues. We also have research data from edge of field and far field studies and the opportunity to open research in areas of need. We are also using innovative technologies and research such as Acpf, as Matt discussed. Collecting all relevant data to an inventory helps the group working on the plan stay organized and readily access the information they need. The inventory is also a great resource when you decide to revise the plan and want to look back on previous information. You have to know your source. Familiarizing yourself with pollutant sources in your watershed is very important. Pollutant loads are typically calculated using in-stream monitoring, so knowing what sources are adding to the pollutant load in their location is critical. Having an idea of the overall water pollutant load is helpful for downstream impacts. It doesn't help you when you want to remediate the stream's water quality. In general, point sources are easier to manage because they're regulated under NPDES permits already. There are certainly situations where those permits are being violated, but the non-point source situations typically need more attention. Non-point sources can be regulated to an extent, but if you decide not to regulate formally, these recommendations for improvements can be just as successful. Understanding the sources in your watershed will better help you with the next topic. Total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, are calculations of the maximum allowed amount of a specific pollutant to enter a water body. The equation for these is equal to the sum of all the point sources plus the sum of all the non-point sources, in addition to a margin of safety. Understanding and at times developing TMDLs is critical to watershed planning. TMDLs are required by the Clean Water Act. States must develop these limits based on a prioritized list of impaired waters. Honestly, anyone could propose a TMDL, but the state is responsible for developing these and submitting them to the federal EPA for approval. Many times you can look up a watershed and find that there are TMDLs already imposed. However, at times there are watersheds in need of TMDLs that have not yet been developed and or approved. Having a TMDL allows those involved in the project to know what standards need to be met at a minimum. You can even take it a step further by finding critical areas and imposing specific load reductions on the area that supersede the restriction of the TMDL. The Clean Water Act provides criteria for state-specific water quality standards. Understanding Ohio's water quality standards is another important part of watershed planning. These standards are updated and revised regularly. This document is publicly available in over 500 pages of literature. To elude some of the information you don't need, you can quickly find what you need by checking out the table of contents. They have specific rules to drainage basins. The water quality standards create a minimum water quality standard for all surface waters of the state. They also provide lists of water in the state with superior quality and or ecological and recreational value. I'd say these serve as good models when thinking how you want your watershed to look. If you work with water quality in any way, I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with this document if you haven't already. When you look up the Watershed of Concern, you will find numerous tables like the one here on the left with an overview map. These use designation charts allow us to determine the aquatic life habitat, water supply, and recreational uses on the water body segments throughout the basin. The document provides great explanations for each delineation, but I'll explain a little further in the next few slides. Remember that there may be overlap on standards and the strictest limit always must be followed. When thinking about water supply, typically remember that these watersheds will have more than one of these. Public means that it's suitable for human intake. It must pass all the federal regulations imposed on drinking water. Typically, we'll think about this with our surface waters within 500 yards of a public water intake, which are required to follow the same regulations. Then we have agricultural, which is water that can be used for irrigation and livestock. And lastly, industrial, which can be used for commercial and or industrial processes without further treatment. The recreational uses are another important factor. You must understand the designated uses to begin to understand the necessary water quality. Our water quality standards divide these recreational uses into 3 categories: bathing water, primary contact recreation, such as swimming, or secondary contact recreation, like boating activities. I know the bathing water can sound odd, but this just means that the water is used heavily for swimming activities, and there's most likely a lifeguard on duty in season. Understanding the biology of your watershed is important as well. According to ODNR, over 90% of Ohio's aquatic life are stream dwelling. For someone that barely passed 101 biology in college, I have a difficult time with this topic, but again, think about your resources and who you can rely on for help here. You have a choice of 4 habitats according to Ohio EPA: limited resource water, modified warm water, and exceptional warm water. You can breathe a sigh of relief. You don't have to determine this on your own. This is laid out for you in Ohio's water quality standards chart that I showed a few slides back. In general, much of Ohio's watersheds fall in the warm water habitat category. Once you understand the habitat type, you can look up the biocriteria and the attainment status. The attainment status is either full, partial, or non-attainment. Full is when the biological indices meet the biocriteria for every value. When they are partial, 1 or more criteria are in attainment and the others are not. Non-attainment reflects poor performance and the indices fail to meet the biocriteria. This system has been used for over 20 years and allows for flexibility and professional judgment to be used to improve aquatic life habitats. Typically, this information is taken and used to do further studies such as TMDL and aquatic assessment studies on fish populations. Data of aquatic life is used to create maps and tables. This should be a collaboration of Ohio's biological water quality indicators such as IBI and MIWB for fish, ICI for macroinvertebrates, and QHEI for the habitat of the watershed. These variables give you tangible knowledge of the health of the watershed. So I put together a quick little template that shows you how this will come together. You have the river mile of the sample source, the total drainage area in square miles, the IBI, the MIWB, the ICI, and the QHEI that I talked about in the last slide, and the attainment status. And then there's a location portion if there's some sort of address or landmark there. Once you have the chart populated, you can compare these values with biological criteria that are listed in Ohio's revised code 3745-1-03 and pinpoint those with significant departures. Keep in mind that the Ohio River lakes and Lake Erie river mouths all have specific criteria. Critical areas coincide with your studies. These are areas in the watershed deemed as being critical. They contribute many pollutants to the overall identified water quality problems in the watershed. You might have already figured this out, but proper critical area determination is critical for a successful plan. The graph on this slide displays the relationship between a pollutant source, magnitude, and the transport potential. Determining where each pollutant falls on the graph allows you to develop prescriptions that will best suit your watershed. Another great graphic is the chart here. It helps break down the factors for determining critical areas and lays out the framework for BMP selection. Matt discussed some of those briefly, so I won't go into detail here, but you can certainly join us in our upcoming webinars to get a detailed look on some of those. So understanding your watershed's critical areas, along with the other information we've talked about, allows you to start setting goals and objectives for your plan. Each goal will improve water quality to relieve stress on an area. The objectives are how you will achieve this goal in mind. This process is really bringing together all your hard work. There's more to the watershed planning process, such as implementation and monitoring, but I don't have time to go into detail of those. I put on a couple important parts during this webinar, but you can always reach out to us if you're interested in more of the details on the other parts. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what's being implemented throughout the state of Ohio. The map we have here outlines all the HUC 8 watersheds throughout the state. The smaller filled in areas are HUC 12 watersheds with approved NPSIS plans or 9-element plans. There's also a pretty cool interactive watershed map that can be accessed on Ohio EPA's site. You can see from this map, this is utilized throughout the state and not just Northwest Ohio. The OSU Extension Water Quality Team is currently working on 14 individual 9-element plans throughout Henry, Paulding, Putnam, Van Wert, Allen, and Mercer counties. I want to repeat those: Henry, Paulding, Putnam, Van Wert, Allen, and Mercer counties. If any of you guys on here live in those counties and have interest in being involved in any of these, please reach out to me or someone on our team. You could even drop into the chat. The HUC 12s, all of which are in Lake Erie, the Lake Erie watershed were chosen due to their state of impairment. The focus of our research is on both far field and near field nutrient impairments. We'll devise phosphorus load reduction goals using 2020 Lake Erie domestic plan. With the near field impairments, we'll use resources such as soil and water assessment tools and other local data. As you can see, many are grouped together, so this allows us to begin our outreach efforts for multiple Hub 12s using the same outreach events and stakeholder groups. We work closely with Ohio EPA, NRCS, local government, producers, other extension employees, and ODA. As Matt discussed earlier, he's really our GIS specialist and working diligently on these outputs for our projects. The rest of our team is starting to work on the foundation of these projects by working with stakeholders to form advisory groups. We've also begun writing these plans. Again, much of this initial work is done by working with the community and learning what they need and are willing to do. We may be the researchers writing these plans, but without the input of the community, we will be useless. Another project our team's involved in is the pilot watershed project in Hardin County. I want to make sure I delineate this from our NPSIS work. It's not part of that, but a project on its own. The watershed is mainly agricultural and a part of the Maumee River watershed, which eventually drains into Lake Erie. The USDA is providing $6.8 million in funding, in addition to $4 million provided through the H2O Ohio Water Quality Initiative. Like our other projects, this will protect and preserve Lake Erie while maintaining productivity on farms. This project drummed up quite a bit of interest and excitement. I'm personally very excited to work on this project as it's in one of my counties, and I believe it will really demonstrate what we can do as we come together. I keep mentioning a critical part of these projects are partnerships. I want to drill that into your all's heads. So as I mentioned, this project has several partners. There's a huge list online if you look it up, and they range from academia, ag companies, producers, and government agencies. The relationships created through this process are very valuable. Sometimes the first version of this plan is not as perfect or usable as originally planned. However, these plans are considered living and never close out until the pollution sources are eliminated. These plans can be viewed as a positive source of energy. In the past, some would view legislative entities as a negative resource, but these plans branch everyone together for the common good of the watershed. Unlike permits or regulations, all stakeholders can voice their concerns, opinions, and practices to determine the healthiest way to improve the water quality in the watershed. Another benefit is funding. Not only are we improving water quality, we're educating people, improving practices, and innovating new ones along the way. I like to think about where we'll be 5 or 10 years from now, all the great ideas we'll think up and implement along the way of this process. I don't want to sugarcoat the process. There are some parts that can be difficult and time consuming. If it was so easy, all the watersheds would already have current plans. It's easy to outline the steps of watershed planning like we've done here, but the difficult part is getting out there and building those relationships. I know I've described these plans as a positive rather than a negative, but it's instinct for some to become defensive when they believe their livelihood is threatened. However, I think OSU has demonstrated time and time again that we as an agricultural community are a huge part of the solution. Of course, it isn't just the ag community. There are numerous plans in Ohio that would be written with a huge focus on urban practices. I certainly don't want to leave out our industrial communities. With the pandemic, it's been difficult to navigate stakeholder outreach. However, this has created flexibility with the planning process. In-person meetings are wonderful, but we can also utilize virtual meetings, surveys, and electronic outreach. Another difficult part of this process can be funding. You could easily become discouraged or overwhelmed, but you just need to stick to your goals. There are numerous resources and many people that have gone through this process that are willing to help. So I'll just close with saying I understand that hearing all of this could be intimidating, but again, it's a group effort. I think I've said group like 10,000 times throughout this presentation. I hope you all are leaving with a better understanding of watershed planning. This time last year, I wasn't part of the OSU team and I was just a viewer on the water quality webinars like you all. At first, with some of these presentations, I would always say, well, I'll listen to it, but there's no way I can help. But after a few, I sat back and said, I need to take at least one piece from the webinar and apply it to my daily life. So that's what I ask you all to do. It could be as simple as talking to your coworkers, friends, or family about the projects. And whoever you are, you have an important part in this process. And I want to thank you for your time and effort. And let's talk and see where you fit into this process. And then here's just a couple of our citations. I guess I will hand it back off to Jordan, I believe.
Yeah, thanks to Matt and Paige for their presentations. First and foremost, we'd like to have questions on the topic. So if you guys could get those into the Q&A, if you have questions, we will be monitoring that. In the meantime, while we may wait on a few or give them a time to get a drink before we answer some questions, what you see on the screen now is a review of how Matt and Paige did as presenters. So this is a way that you guys can rate them. It helps them for feedback on how they can improve going forward with their teaching. And it also helps as they do year-end reviews next year through the OSU system. So that was a QR code. There's also a website. What's actually going to happen is when this webinar closes, you will be redirected to this specific survey or review of Matt and Paige to a website. So we ask that everyone please fill that out as it helps us become better teachers. And then also we have CCA credits available. That'll pop up here in a second. There's a QR code for that. If you guys are unable to get the QR code to work, email myself, beck.320@osu.edu. I can help with that. Paige could also help with that. It's peterson.269@osu.edu. And you can get CCA credits for that. We'd also just like everyone to remember to check out the Agronomic Crops YouTube page, as that has all of our presentations from the water quality, as well as any webinars and presentations that are happening around the agronomic crops team through OSU Extension. And then finally, I think we'll put a link in the chat to register for upcoming Water Quality Wednesday programs. So if you got registered for this one, but you're not registered, I think we have 3 more coming this winter. We'd encourage you to sign up and attend those as well. I think we have some great topics and great speakers coming up also. And with that, it looks like we have a couple questions coming in here. It says, from Jason, I've been trying to get some research for water runoff. How do we reach out to the correct people to see about setting something up? Let Matt and Paige answer that.
Hey, Jason. Yeah, what county are you in, Jason? Is it I think I've been over to your place before for some research. There are water quality associates down there in that county. I'm not sure which county you're in though. Oh, Bridget says that she's working with Jason. I guess, Bridget, that must be your county.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I do Allen, Mercer, and Always County, but because watersheds kind of bleed over into other counties, the entire team has kind of branched out to other counties as well. So if you want to start like a more specific project with one of the associates who has expertise in a different area, feel free to check out our website. The link will be in the chat, and you can read through our bios, and you can reach out to any one of us and maybe further any research plans you might be thinking of.
Okay, and then I think we have one from Kay that says, what type of grasses are planted in grass waterways? Do either of you want to tackle that? Or who you could refer Kay to?
I'm not sure. I would just say some type of like non-erosive type of seed. I don't know if Matt has any idea, but we could certainly, I'm not sure. I'm still pretty new at OSU. I'm not sure who exactly would be the best to give you the direction there.
I would say, Kay, if you're getting that grass waterway funded through a grant or a program through Soil and Water or another program, they usually have recommendations on what would work best in your area. So maybe reach out to Soil and Water or NRCS if you're working with one of those 2 organizations on that. Looks like we have a comment from Heather. we have received a $6 million Tri-State RCPP award. That's going to provide additional funds for conservation practices in our Western Lake Erie Basin. So we're excited to get started on that. And these funds will be additional to 319 funds or GLRI funds. And we'll discuss these at the stakeholder meeting. So that's a question I had. You did encourage people to reach out and be involved, especially if they're in one of those 14 HUC 12 watersheds. This seems very preliminary, so I know it can take time and it could be a couple years before we see the results of this, but why do people need to get involved now? And by getting involved now, how does that help eliminate some headaches later? That
I
can be
think I think just us knowing like stakeholder names and just having an idea of who's interested in being involved is great, because when we do have information, like I mentioned in my presentation, keeping people informed. So if we have some updates or anything that we can share, we know directly who to go to with that information as we get it.
Yeah, I can speak from some experience working up here in Fulton and Williams County. They have a number of these NPSIS plans in place for different watersheds. And that allowed the soil and water groups from both counties to come together. They could apply for a grant a lot easier and get funding for grassed waterways in the area. So they're able to help the producers have money to do that. And a lot of that was stemmed from having these NPSIS plans already in place. So I think it's helpful to see that and see that that was a practice that was wanted and needed by landowners in the area.
Yeah, it's really great to have that research behind you to show why you need something, not just, oh, I think this would work. You actually have solid research to show what you're hoping to do.
Absolutely. This next question might be for Matt, since you have experience with the Acpf tool. I don't know if you can answer it or not, but it says, considering the increasing amounts of rainfall Ohio is experiencing, can drainage tiles be reduced? Have you seen any of that in your work, Matt, where maybe things have changed?
Well, certainly by reducing the subsurface drainage, that might help some of the problems we have with water quality. But in terms of agronomics, a lot of times that's just not feasible. I think a lot of times, we see, increase in yields with better drainage in soils, and with a lot of the heavy soils that we have, and particularly up in Northwest Ohio, especially, decreasing some of that subsurface drainage is really going to have a negative impact on some of the crops. So it can be done. I don't know how feasible it is, though, in terms of, a production standpoint.
Looks like we have a question from Bowden as well. Will the NPSIS outreach meetings be listed on our website, or where can people get information on when those meetings will occur and where they will occur?
Yes, they will be listed on our website. And then we also reach out to local soil and water and things like that to give potential stakeholders those updated times and dates.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone, if you're working with your soil and water or your local extension office, check out their social media. That's how we usually push out a lot of these type of events, along with the websites. But if we can get it up on Facebook or other social media, sometimes we have a bigger reach that way than just through some website clicks. Reminder for Kay, I think you're asking about the drainage. February 2nd, we will be having another Water Quality Wednesday program that will be focused on drainage. So if you have concerns about that, you can check that one out and maybe ask some more questions there.
While we wait on some more questions, I'm just going to navigate back to those last couple slides if people need the codes for, this is for the survey, and then I'll flip back to CCA here in a minute.
We have a comment from Scott and maybe a question if either of you have experience with this. He produces biochar, and he says that is a great product to use in waterways. It captures deposits and pollution from the outside waterways. So I don't know if I don't have any experience with that. I don't know if any of our other team members have experience with biochar.
I might not be thinking of the same product, but I don't know if you can respond in the chat, Scott. Is that like a byproduct of like mortality and manure, or is that a different? Because the biochar that I'm thinking of is like a fertilizer almost.
I think with that, we thank you for attending, and you're welcome to stay on and continue to ask questions, but I believe we've got you the CCA credits, and thanks for coming. You guys are welcome to go about your day.
Thanks, guys.